The footage currently on screen was shot on a vintage 8mm camera in Central Park a few years ago. It was shot on a Kodak 200T film stock. Except I lied, and only the first one is 8mm film. The second is actually digital footage made to look like 8mm film. So I'm sure a few people with a tuned eye would have noticed this straight away. However, I'm willing to bet a lot of people didn't notice the difference. I've been really interested in shooting and emulating analog film stocks for a long time now, and about a year ago I released an advanced tutorial using the plugin Dehancer to create an authentic 8mm look inside DaVinci Resolve. I was pleased with the reception of that video, but one of the comments I got quite a lot was people asking for a power grade. Recently I worked on a project that required 8mm emulation, but involved sharing the project file between machines, and not everyone had Dehancer. As a result, I had to build up an emulation from scratch only using DaVinci Resolve Studio plugins. I ended up building a power grade that I was really pleased with and very happy with the final results, and the people I was working with at the time on the project were really impressed too. And this inspired me to go a little bit further and to create 5 unique film emulations based around the 8mm look that I've bundled up into a power grade pack. During the COVID lockdown, I started an online store with my good friend and close collaborator Mark Miko. The store's called Eclipsy.tv, and it basically aims to take the best bits of retro analog formats and make them accessible to digital filmmakers and creators. The idea is not to replace analog formats, but instead to give access to some of the qualities of these great formats to people who don't have the time, the budget, or the accessibility yet to work with them. And if anyone's interested, that's also something I'm happy to make a video on, because that journey taught me a lot about generating passive income as a filmmaker and being able to pay the bills in between work coming in or having the budget for the projects you really want to be working on. But it made sense to me that this was the perfect place to put this power grade, and so I went ahead, uploaded it to the store, and it's now available to purchase. And so today I thought it'd be fun to just kind of experiment a bit and play around and explore this power grade and break down how I approach 8mm film emulation and how I got the shots at the beginning of this video. Now, of course, it goes without saying you don't need my power grade to follow along with this tutorial. Hopefully this will also inspire and educate a lot of people and show, I guess, a bit of my approach, my philosophy and my workflow towards 8mm emulation. But for those who want to be able to just drag and drop this into their own work and into their own projects, I'll leave a link down in the description below to the full pack. But for now, I thought we could just go through, take a look at some different clips shot on different cameras and see what kind of different 8mm inspired retro film looks we can get. So I've gone ahead and made a new timeline, and I've brought in a few clips for us to work with today. These are shot on different cameras using different color spaces, and I thought it'd be fun to just try and get different looks and see how the different I guess source clips react to the emulation. So essentially we have a couple clips here which were shot on the Sony a7R II. Now this is in Rec 709. And then the next batch of clips was shot on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K in log. I think this is Film Gen 5 as the color science. And then we have 2 clips shot on the iPhone 15 Pro using AppleLog. And then just to round things off, I've got a shot here which was captured in Central Park, and this is shot in Rec 709 on a camcorder. And we then have the exact same shot but captured on real 8mm film, and what I'm going to do essentially is just try and get our digital footage as close as possible to our original reference. Okay, so I want to start off by having a look at some real 8mm clips and using these as a reference just to give us that basic idea of the kind of characteristics we're going to be looking at today. So these are real shots shot on various different film stocks over the years, and basically let's just have a quick look through and just be looking at some of the characteristics. So one of the first things you'll probably notice is obviously we have that very dreamy look, you know, everything's quite, I guess, defocused, it's not a very sharp image. We have quite big and thick grain, we have nice bloom and minor halation going on in the highlights. We have a lot of gate weave, you can actually see, you know, bits of like hair and dust and stuff from the actual camera over the top, you know, different scan lines, different light leaks, things like that, over the top of the image. All the colors look very different to what we'd expect out of a digital image. It has that real filmic look, and we have a lot of flickering going on in our image as well, which really makes that grain look real, because obviously it is. Now here's a black and white film, this is a very old one, and again, you can see this this one also looks almost like orthochromatic. It's, you know, all I guess what would be the reds look, you know, completely black, which is something that we'll keep in mind for later. So we're back on our main timeline, and it's time to start playing around with these power grades and just start seeing what looks we can get and experimenting with different parameters and settings. I'm going to run through the node tree and explain how everything works. This is the clip we're going to start with. This is just a shot of my friend Jacob driving in the south of France. It's a really nice shot, and we have lots of greens and nice colours to play around with. So if we come into our color tab, I've gone ahead and imported in all of our different power grades. So there's 5 different film stock looks. I have in this album here the Rec 709 version and the Film Gen 5 version. These will work with any color space, as I'm going to show you, but these ones have basically been adapted just to work best as kind of drag and drop if you're using these color spaces as a starting point. So as our footage is Rec 709, we're going to be having a look at the Rec 709 base power grades, and essentially we're just going to hover our mouse over and start seeing what looks we like. So we have a Kodak 200T film here, we have a 50D, we have a D55 Kodak 2383 print film, which I quite like the look of, we have a 2-strip Technicolor, and then we have a Tri-X inspired orthochromatic black and white film stock. So I've gone ahead and I've reset this particular shot, and as you see, our original is very sharp, very digital. It's the kind of shot you might expect to see shot on a Sony A7 and shot on a nice lens, a Sigma, I think it was a Sigma Art lens. So let's go ahead and drop our first power grade back on the 200T, and let's just look at our image. So already it looks so much softer, so much more filmic, and it looks like the grain is actually interacting with our image, which is really nice. For this particular shot, I feel like our highlights look a bit blown out and we're losing some detail, we're losing some colour as a result. So one thing I'm going to want to do is just bring the exposure down a little bit and introduce a bit more contrast, which will hopefully make our colours pop a bit more. And also I think in this case, as much as I like how soft it is, I think it's a little bit over the top, so I'm just going to bring the blur down a bit as well. So let's go ahead and come to our correct tab here, and I'm going to start by pulling down our highlights, somewhere like there. I'm going to bring lift down a little bit. Again, just introducing a bit more contrast, and as you see, our colours are looking much nicer now, and we're really taking advantage of that filmic colour emulation. I'm now going to come over to our blur, and we're just going to drag this down a little bit. I'm going to say something like, let's try like 59 perhaps. And even just that small adjustment does make a big difference here, so be very conservative with these adjustments on the blur here. But something like that to me is looking great. You know, even looking at the way the grain's reacting with the road and how it looks different depending on what part of the image we're looking at, I'm really happy with this. And if we compare this to some real Super 8, as you see, it's much closer than we were before, and this is a look I'd be very happy with using. Even just looking at things like the house and the way the halation is subtle, the way the bloom is subtle, definitely feels very in line to me with my references. Now we can quickly have a look at some of the other film looks. For example here, if we wanted to, just copy these adjustments, if we wanted to put on 50D, this is a daylight stock, so it's going to look much cooler, which is, in this particular case, looks really nice. We could also warm this back up a little bit if we wanted, but in this case I quite like how cool this looks. Again, as you see, we have that same sort of filmic look, but just a different colour profile. D55, do the same thing. This is going to be a bit closer to the 200T. But as you see, it's kind of a sort of warmer, and again, we have a different colour profile. Then we have the two more extreme ones, so we have our 2 strips. This is mimicking early Technicolor film, which you wouldn't necessarily get on 8mm, but it's a really nice stylistic look, I think, that's very specific. We could sort of adjust the hue here as well, although you've got to be very careful with how much you do this. This is kind of like the aviator look. I did a separate video on this one a couple of months ago. Then we have our orthochromatic black and white stock, which looks very moody, very atmospheric. And this is something I can imagine using this look on like a cool artsy music video, or for sort of cutaways. I actually graded a film like this once and it came out looking very very creepy, quite surreal. And so, you know, we could go ahead and apply this to different shots. Here's one of my friend Harry playing with some tools that we found in a garage in France. So again, here I could just drop on a look, and already we're just getting a much nicer, softer image, filmic. We have that mild halation, and of course this doesn't necessarily have to just be 8mm film. We could come in here and we could adjust things a little bit. We could bring down the shake of the weave, we could bring down the flicker a little bit, and we could change our film grain to be 35mm. So we could come on here and start with like a 200T, bring this up a little bit. You know, we could go for a more 35mm look and start tweaking these settings around and still have that kind of soft filmic look. Again, I'm going to bring this down a little bit to like 55. So we've gone from a digital look, so you don't necessarily have to go all the way to the 8mm kind of extreme with it. We can still get some very nice filmic emulations just playing around. So these are really fully customizable. You can really kind of dial them in and just kind of get the different looks you want. This one looks kind of cool here. I might bring the lift up a bit on this one. Overall exposure down. And again, you can really take your time kind of dialing in all the settings on here and all the different parameters, but I find a lot of the time the correct tab is really where a lot of the work goes on, and then it's just a matter of fine-tuning the emulation look based on exactly what you're going for. See, something like this looks very cool. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at working on some of these different color spaces. Now it's going to be exactly the same process, but obviously these were just shot on different cameras. So this is the footage shot on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K in log. As you see, we've got some cool shots of some sheep here. We've got this creepy shot of my friend Josh in a mask that he made. This was for a music video we did a few years ago. And so if we come to our Gen 5 for the color science, as you see, looking at this, I can tell that the white balance on this shot is maybe a bit towards the cool side, so we're going to have to warm that up, and it's a little bit underexposed. But it's looking really cool. That one especially looks very cool. So let's go ahead and put our 200T on. I'm going to come to correct. I'm just going to bring up the overall exposure, and I'm going to go ahead and warm this image up. Looks much nicer. And then I'm going to boost the saturation just a little bit. And I'm really liking what this is doing to our image. And then I'm going to come in and maybe just turn our blur down. Just maybe like 61. There we go. To me, this is looking really cool. This is a great filmic image. Okay, so I'm really pleased with this, and I love what it's done to the colors. Now, just for a comparison, I've gone ahead and brought in the same clip, but just converted it to Rec 709 and made similar color corrections, but without applying the power grade. And as you can see, it's a completely different feel, completely different vibe to our filmic look. And of course, another thing that we could do is just use the colors. So we could go ahead and take off all of our emulation. So we disable our blur, disable our grain, halation. We could maybe keep halation actually. Take off our sharpen, dirt, flicker, and you would end up with just your sharp digital image, but using the color emulations of the Kodak stock. So there's a lot we can do with this, but obviously in this case I'm going to re-enable all of these. Let's see how this looks on these other shots here, so I can go ahead and copy this across. In this case I might bring the highlights down a little bit, and I might cool this down a tiny bit. It's a cool slow-mo shot of Josh running towards the camera. And then we have the shot of our sheep here. Again, this is looking a little bit on the cool side. Maybe let's try 50D for this particular shot. Let's bring our exposure back up a little bit. Highlights down. Really boost our saturation quite a lot on this shot. It's quite flat. This is a very cool image. And again, we could bring our blur down again a little bit. And you'll find as well, depending on how close you are to the subject, you'll need more or less softening in a lot of cases. But that to me looks really cool. And something else we can do actually is we can come on and we can add a few overlays over the top. So here I have the overlay pack. I'll leave a link in the description to this, but we have some real film grains that we could kind of put over the top as well. So we could go ahead and drop this on, for example, and these can be looped. And then what we'll do is come into our composite mode. We'll put this onto screen. And now what we've introduced is some real 8mm grain and dirt and dust over the top, which just goes to sell the image a bit further. And if we wanted to, again, we could bring in some borders as well. So we could, bring in a border like this. And we're moving much closer to that kind of 8mm emulation look that we were going for. Okay, let's quickly move on to the iPhone footage. I've got a couple here shot on AppleLog, and this is where I think things get really cool, because if you think about how small an iPhone is and how easy it is to shoot on, and the fact that now you can shoot on log, I mean, there's countless videos talking about the perks and the advantages of being able to shoot on an iPhone. But what I think is great is actually how good film emulation can look on iPhone footage. And you think you could shoot a feature film that looks like it was shot on 16mm with current technology, which is a new thing, or at least new at the level that you're now able to do it at. So let's go ahead and add on, I'm going to say 50D. Interestingly enough, this actually looks pretty good with the Gen 5 color science, but let's go ahead to our CST and let's just change this to AppleLog. Now I tend to find that with AppleLog on this node tree, it tends to make things a little bit underexposed, so we're going to come into our corrections and just make up for that. I'm going to bring the lift up a little bit as well, and let's just see if we want to maybe warm it up literally the tiniest bit. Might want to push our saturation a tiny bit as well. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like. Now I tend to find, again, stuff shot on the iPhone tends to be a little bit softer when shot in the Blackmagic app, so we're going to want slightly less softening in this case. And something like this looks really cool, especially with that handheld look. I'm a big fan of how this is looking. I might want to bring the sharpening down a little bit on this. So let's go ahead and come to our sharpen. Just reduce this number. Something like that I'm very happy with. And again, this looks to me like it could be sort of 16mm film or something of the likes. And we can come in here as well. Let's have a look at, let's try D55 for this one. Again, I'm going to bring our highlights down. Bring our lift down a little bit. Overall exposure. And then we can kind of play around a little bit with our saturation up, get some cool colours peeking there. Now if you told me 10 years ago that you'd be able to get an image like this shot on an iPhone, I'd be amazed. I'm really pleased with this. In fact, it inspires me. I might do a video soon talking a bit about, perhaps setting a challenge to make a film of some description on the iPhone. I've done a few in the past, but I think one with this look would be very, very cool. So I'm just going to go through these nodes and just explain to you what's happening at each point in the chain, just giving you a basic overview. The first node in our chain here is CST. Now this stands for color space transform. And so essentially what this node is doing is it's taking the input color space and input gamut of our source footage and it's outputting it into Cine on FilmLog, which is the gamut that the emulation is working in. So if we click on effects here, essentially we can change our input color space and our input gamma. Now in this case, my footage is Rec 709. I'm working in a Rec 709 timeline, so I'm leaving this on use timeline. But for example, if I shot this on an iPhone, so here's something shot on an iPhone 15, an AppleLog, I would come into the CST tab here and under input gamma, I would change this to AppleLog. And of course now what we're doing is we're basically matching the gamma and we then match the color space to our source footage. So whatever camera you shot this on, find out what you shot this in, color space wise and gamma wise, match these and then it will output it into Cine on FilmLog ready for the emulation. So our next node, correct, is basically for color corrections and image adjustments. Now this is basically anything before we hit our emulation. So this will be changing our exposure, our highlights, our shadows if we need to, maybe changing our contrast. Here we can change our white balance, things like that. So basically anything that needs to be done to the image before the emulation is going to be done on this node. If you like to keep these adjustments separate, by all means you can go ahead and introduce some more nodes with Alt-S and start keeping things separate here. But for me, I like to keep things compact and simple, so we're just going to be doing our corrections on this correct node here. The next node is blur. Now this is basically just adding some film blur and just de-sharpening the image a bit. So as you see here, we just have a blur here. We can adjust the radius. So if we want, we can push this more. If we want, we can bring this down and we'll get our image looking more sharp again. Now this is one thing I'd say don't shy away from, but at the same time, I've worked very hard to try and match this to the qualities and how sharp real 8mm film looked in my references that I used, and I consulted many references. But equally, depending on how sharp your source footage is and depending on what kind of shot it is, this will need adjusting. So you just come in here and if it's looking a bit too sharp, you just push it up. And if it's looking a bit too defocused and hazy and blurry, we're just going to bring this back down. But definitely don't shy away from this. I think this is one of the mistakes a lot of people make when they're emulating 8mm film is they'll end up with something too sharp because they're kind of afraid to push it to the point that real 8mm film would be at. So that's our film blur node. The next node is one that we shouldn't have to make too many adjustments to. It's basically just emulating the colors, the profile, the characteristics of the specific film stock. Now this will change depending obviously on if you're on 2-strip, Tri-X, 50D, etc. Now a variety of different methods was used when profiling these films. All of them started with an original film source and used some form of shot matching or thought out emulation to essentially get it to look as close as possible. Now these have all been designed specifically for this chain, so I did start with color passports and color checkers and basically had digital and then had the real film stock and basically have matched the colors as close as possible. So essentially what this is going to be doing is applying the characteristics and the look of that film stock at this point in the chain. Next up we have our grains, so basically we just have film grain on this node here, and I've gone ahead and made a custom preset where I've looked side by side at lots of different reference clips and come up with a basically great middle ground, authentic looking 8mm grain, and obviously this will need to be tweaked depending on what shot you have and what kind of look you're going for. Obviously if we're shooting a real 8mm film, the grain might be stronger, might be smaller, might be larger, depending on the film stock, the exposure, things like that. So you can come in here and make adjustments, but my hope is that in a lot of cases you'll be able to just drag and drop this power grade on and you won't have to make any major changes here apart from perhaps just the odd tweak. Next we have our halation. Now this is where the bloom and the halation characteristics of 8mm film are emulated. We can come in here and again we can change these levels if we need to. As you see we have our secondary glow. This is where we kind of have our halation, and then I'm kind of using the first one as kind of our bloom. Now one thing I noticed, at least in my reference clips, is that the halation that you get on 8mm often is quite subtle and isn't over the top. Quite often with film emulations you'll find that it can be overpowering or it can look a bit fake, so I've gone ahead and I've tried to emulate it as best as I can whilst keeping it subtle, so the more you push the highlights it will kind of give you that glow if you need it, but ultimately it's just giving us that general bloom look and the halation in general. So as you see, if I turn it on and off, it's really giving us that look, but it's also keeping things fairly subtle. Next we have dirt. Now this is just dust and dirt basically, so we kind of get the flickering look over the top of the odd bit of dust, the odd bit of dirt appearing on the image. We can go ahead and increase this or bring it down if we need to. Next in the chain we have flicker. This is basically just adding a flicker to our image, which kind of emulates the shutter and also emulates, I guess, like projection and scanning. So essentially, as you see, if you watch the grain on the screen here, you'll be able to see we have this flickering taking place, which really helps sell the overall film look. If I take it off, you'll see we have the grain, but it kind of looks a bit more like it's just been placed over the top. Once we add the flicker, it kind of has a bit more life and a bit more character. We can adjust this by changing the range. As you see, it's a very low number, but if we bring this up to something like 20, it's going to be much more exaggerated. You see here, we now have that flicker. So again, depending on the exposure of your shot and how your shot looks, we can change this amount. Obviously, we can definitely overdo it, but I think, you know, on this shot I might put it something like 13 because that looks quite nice and it just gives us that sort of organic look. Next we have sharpen. Now essentially what this does is it just sharpens our image, and now what's great is because we've blurred the image and we've added grain, when we sharpen it, the grain is really going to look like it's in the image, and we're going to start to get the look that you get when you see either an old film that's been digitized or a modern film scan, where essentially because we have the analog film being scanned in, we kind of get that, we kind of introduce a little bit of sharpness, but it just helps give us that 8mm look that we're used to seeing. So if we come into our effects here, we can bring up the sharpen amount, as you see, and what's going to essentially happen is, as you see, the grain becomes more, the whole image becomes sharper. We definitely want to keep this subtle, we don't want to overdo this at all, and there'll be some cases where you might want to bring this down or even turn this node off, and it's going to give us a much softer look, but just bring it up just a little bit is just going to bring out that grain, bring out those highlights in a way that's just really going to help enhance the general look of this emulation. Next we have weave, which is basically just using a camera shake on a very specific setting to basically just create some weave in our image. This is one that you, again, might want to dial in depending on the shot. If you have like a tripod shot and it's overkill, or if you're trying to emulate 16mm with this power grade, then feel free to go ahead and adjust these settings. Lastly, we have print. Now basically what this is doing in essence is taking us out of Cine on FilmLog back into Rec 709. So I'm doing this using a LUT, which is included in DaVinci Resolve, and I actually use this quite often on real 8mm scans, which is just the Rec 709 Kodak 2383 D55 print film emulation. Now this helps give us some more filmic characteristics at the end of the chain as well. If you wanted to, you could go ahead and just replace this with a CST, just to bring it directly into Rec 709, but I feel that introducing these film characteristics looks really strong and helps sell the overall look. Now our final node here is adjust. This is just for final adjustments that you might want to make at the end. You might want to warm up the film or make some grading choices. Most of the heavy lifting is going to be going on in the correct tab, but this just gives us the option to add anything at the end should we need to. Okay, so just to close things, I thought what we'd do is take this real 8mm shot. Now this is of me sat on a rock in Central Park for a project I did a couple of years ago. And essentially what we're going to do is try and take this digital shot of the exact same thing, shot at the same time. And this was captured on a Panasonic 4K camcorder. And what we're going to try and do is see how close we can get this to our film shot. Okay, so let's start off by just having a look through the power grades and just seeing which is going to be the best base for us to start off with. So if we have a look at the 200T, that looks pretty good. Let's have a look at the 50D and the D55. So in this case, I think the D55 is going to be the best. So I'm going to click on this and apply this. Now, one thing we have to be mindful of is on this particular shot, because it was shot in automatic settings on the camcorder, there's an exposure change. So what we have as our exposure at the beginning is quite different from when we zoom in, so we just got to be mindful of that. I'm going to start by just matching, I guess, like the first frame as best as I can, but after that, obviously, then we're going to have to tweak, and obviously we could go through and automate the exposure on this, but just for the sake of this video, I'm just going to try and keep things simple. So already, as you can see, just applying that looks so much closer to our reference, but like I say, we can dial this in a bit more. So if we come onto our correct tab, let's go ahead and push up our exposure a little bit. I'll bring our highlights down a tiny bit. Although I don't know, they're quite, yeah, something like that. And then I'm going to push up our saturation, 58 I reckon, and make it a little bit warmer. This is looking much nicer. I think we have slightly less contrast actually in our Super 8, so I'm just going to bring the lift up a little bit. So let's have a look now. So already that's looking so much closer, and as you see, this is quite an out of focus shot. We definitely have more gate weave on the real 8mm, so I'm going to come into our weave here, and I'm just going to bring up our motion scale. I also might want to bring up our flicker a little bit. A bit too much, bring that down. Now the grain on our original looks a bit more intense, so I'm going to go ahead and bring up the grain, and I'm also going to add in an overlay on this particular shot. So one thing I might do is actually bring the sharpening down a tiny bit on this one. Yeah, and then I might go into our grain. I'm just going to make a few adjustments here. So here's our original 8mm, and then here's our digital made to look like 8mm. As you see, I think that's pretty close, at least to my eye. We could, like I say, take this a step further and add on like an overscan. So we could go ahead and add on an overscan here to our image, and then just zoom this in so we just have the edge of it in frame actually. And then I'm just going to go ahead and add in a grain overlay as well. So I'm going to come into our grains here, and this looks pretty good to me, so I'm just going to drag this in, set this to screen mode. And this is just going to add that extra bit of grain and just life to the image. Now one thing we can also see is the speed of the original 8mm is slightly different. It looks almost sped up. I'm going to guess we shot maybe at 18 frames per second and it was scanned at 24, so I could also just come in and speed this up a little bit just to create that kind of effect that we're going for. So something like that would be cool. And so there we go. We've gone ahead and replicated that 8mm shot with our digital footage. Now if I go ahead and, just for the sake of reference, let's go ahead and take the grade off. As you see, it's like a completely different look. Now, if we wanted to, we could continue to really work on this image and getting it looking even more close to our original source image, but for the sake of today, and for the sake of the time we had and how quickly we were able to do that, I'm very happy with how that's turned out. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. And like I say, I'll leave a link in the description below to the power grades if you're interested. I'll be returning to some more camera-based and gear-based DIY videos soon, and I apologise for the delay in getting videos out. I was away for a while and then I was at London Film Festival and have been working on a few projects that have been very time consuming, but I'm trying to fall into a routine of making videos hopefully every 2 weeks or at least once a month. So thank you for bearing with me whilst life has been hectic. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you next time.